Now, for the benefit for our wider audience, Scott has serves as a GRC consulting manager for OneTrust GRC. It's a purpose-built software company designed to operationalize integrated risk management. And in his role, Scott is responsible for driving the development and delivery of OneTrust integrated risk management product, as well as driving the refinement of the tool set and offerings. So he advises companies all over the world and is definitely available to work with all of you. But I think you will find his own comments now will be very helpful. Over to you, Scott. Thank you.
That's great. Thank you very much. Yes, Scott Bridgen, I head up our global risk team. I've worked for UK Ministry of Defence, US Department of Defence, as well as many GRC and risk providers over the years. And we're going to go through, I'm going to tie this back to privacy. But basically, because privacy and cyber risk are so intertwined, I'm going to give you some oversight into some elements around cybersecurity. So next slide, please. Next slide, please. My team have done well. Okay, we're going to go through 3 key areas this morning. So first things first, the extent of your cyber exposure, which is ever increasing. The attack surface is getting bigger and bigger and bigger. With the world working from home, it's actually probably been at its greatest, certainly from a control perspective. We're then going to look at getting business buy-in, and these are conversations that are definitely worth having that some people choose to avoid. And then we're going to look at actually what kind of initiatives can we have in place to continue from that perspective. Next slide, please. Actually, next slide. We don't need to go through who OneTrust are. It's okay. We'll next slide, please. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. Okay. Next slide. Perfect. So the emerging risk aspect. So we're all aware of GDPR and other evolving regulations. There is also the issue at the moment from that perspective when we're talking about cyber exposure around new technology. And shadow IT is one of those issues that tends to fall to the IT and infrastructure team. But the problem is shadow IT presents everyone a problem, especially those within compliance and from a privacy perspective. If you think about it, with the world working from home currently, you'll have people accessing company network and information on their standardized devices. The problem is they extend those devices into a range of printers, other elements from that perspective that we might not be able to track. And it gets even worse the minute you've got iPhones and iPads and other devices. People want to work from the garden whilst it's sunny. They connect to the corporate network or they connect it via the VPN. And suddenly you have a device that doesn't have the correct security, doesn't have the right credentials, accessing data that would normally only be accessed through authorized devices. The problem that means is that we have a higher level of data processing. So data processing is increased. And then from that perspective, that means that the risk is emerging. Now, emerging risk generally is being talked about a lot. Now, privacy has been classed as an emerging risk, although I feel like it's been around for a long time and it's a bit unfair to class it as emerging now. But the problem that we have is that there are a lot of other issues off of the back of this. One of the biggest emerging risks at the moment is around the prevention of unauthorized devices to our networks. So from that perspective, it's interesting that the threat, effectively, the threat has become greater. My apologies if my dog is trying to get onto my lap. There we go. This is why I don't have a camera. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, organizational structure and operations. So look, this is the interesting part where traditionally, if we were all in our offices, this would be not a relatively easy exercise, but I'm sure a lot of you, especially when we're talking about GDPR, you've done your critical infrastructure. You've looked at where your critical assets lie, what kind of data they have. You've done your structured and unstructured data. You've looked at your business units. You've also looked at the type of information you're processing, the exchanges that are occurring both in country, out of country, in EU, outside of EU. And you started to align business practices. The problem is again, because a vast majority of the workforce is working from home, the issue that we've got is that a lot of these elements have started to change. Yes, your critical infrastructure has exactly remained the same. Your data probably still lives there, but the exchange is happening actually at a slightly different way. And the problem that you've got is that we need to ensure from a security standpoint that that data is safe and secure and that individuals aren't accessing it where they shouldn't be. Business units as well, from that perspective, is quite an interesting aspect because our traditional business units also basically have changed, because the traditional business units are no longer something that we can go and see and feel and touch and audit to ensure that they are complying with the correct regulations, standards, procedures, etc. My apologies. Every time someone chats, it comes up on my screen. I just have to kill it. There we go. And also that documents, that processes from that perspective are fundamentally changing. The organization, whether it's HR, whether it's a business, whether it's IT, have issued new guidance around how individuals should be operating when they're working from home. So effectively, everything is changing and people are having to continually learn. Now, I know that the world is beginning to unlock, and that means that people will be slowly returning back to work. The problem is you're going to have some individuals that still need to work from home for whatever reason. And the problem that we've got is actually, as an exercise, it's worth looking at all of your employees, actually where they're working from, and sending out assessments or questionnaires to ensure that they are complying with internal security controls. For example, policy is one of the best ways of doing this. Revisions of policy are made. A lot of people are requested to go and have a look, but not many people are collecting attestations. What you really need to do to try and understand that everyone understands what their responsibility is obtaining attestations from those individuals working from home. Next slide, please. And then third-party relationships. This is one of the most interesting aspects because a lot of organizations or a lot of people have done their traditional assessments. They've looked at their key core critical suppliers and providers, and because a vast majority of their services are outsourced, normally IT services or software or infrastructure, the problem that we've got is a lot of people haven't started to re-look at their third parties during the COVID crisis. Now, this means that there have been some organizations, if we look at retail, for example, retail have obviously been hugely hit. Those with stores, storefronts, with the inability to receive deliveries from whatever country it may well be. For, more importantly, actually not even being able to open their stores. Cleaners not being able to go in and clean. Deliveries not being made because of reduced services. And even transport and freight not being able to bring deliveries actually to their warehouses prior to distribution. So a lot of the issue that organizations have actually been primarily around their third parties. Now, we have well over 2,500 customers that use our third-party software, and we sent out assessments, basic questionnaires to find out the impact of their third parties. And over 60% of respondents had identified there have been issues with their third-party supply chain. Now, traditionally, people will, as I said, you'll send out an assessment, you'll send out a questionnaire of some description to see if they've got ISO 27001, they're going to comply from a GDPR perspective, they're not passing data outside of the economic area or data residency issue. I mean, all of the aspects that you traditionally do from a compliance standpoint. But one thing is have you since actually looked at your key and core and critical suppliers, and have you been able to get confirmation that in the event of them losing critical ability to operate, that they're still going to be able to provide you with the services that you rely on? And it's interesting, some people have done this, but a lot of organizations haven't done this as an exercise. And the problem is you can't wait until the critical services are unable to be provided. Now, as I said, we're coming out of the back end of this, hopefully, which means that moving forward, it should be something now from a business continuity standpoint, should no longer belong to IT. It's no longer about return time objectives and recovery point objectives and traditional operational resiliency. This is now more about looking at all aspects of enterprise business continuity. And I think actually the chief risk officer should wholly own this moving forward as an exercise, rather than just being a member of a team that everyone belongs to. The reason being is everything is part of business continuity. Privacy. Can we keep our data safe? Have we got the ability to process the correct data at the right time? The third parties that we're using, are they able to keep our data safe? Can we exchange data safely, securely, and on point? Should we be exchanging that data? Should we be doing that process? So the problem that you have fundamentally moving forward is, from a business continuity standpoint, the criticality of third parties, of business risk, operational risk, all tie up to enterprise risk. Next slide, please. So, establishing a baseline. One of the things that organizations should start doing is actually looking at what controls they can put into place to mitigate and reduce this risk. So, obviously, we look at our standard and mandatory desires from that perspective. So we'll look at GDPR, we'll look at ISO, we'll look at NIST, we'll look at COBIT, IRAM2, all of the relevant elements from a risk and security frameworks and laws and regulations we have to comply with. But what we also need to start to look at is actually measuring that from a cybersecurity standpoint and where our exposure lies. It's no longer just about servers and threat actors trying to gain access to them. Those guys haven't taken a break. They've not been affected by COVID. So obviously, in fact, actually, they've probably had increased access because they recognize that because organizations are working from home, because organizations are working from home, it's actually easier to perform lots of different types of attacks. So from that perspective, measuring a cybersecurity baseline by almost organizing a list of what are the critical assets, where are the critical assets being held, how secure are they, how are they being monitored from that perspective, who has access and identity management from that standpoint. Start to understand actually the number of failed attempts on passwords, the number of attempts outside of your expected user base from that perspective. So lastly, you then want to put controls into place. So from a control standpoint, it's really important to relook at the controls that you already have. Are new controls required? Working from home deems basically the ability for individuals to access company data. And as I mentioned previously, if they're accessing that on a laptop or a tablet or an iPhone or another device outside of the standard approved technology, data could basically get accessed. Sorry, my apologies. This dog. Data could actually get accessed and shared, and more importantly, lost or stolen. So ensuring that the right controls are in place from that perspective is absolutely key and critical. And looking at your critical controls that you had in place previously, it might be worth time to revise and simplify from that perspective. Next slide, please. So getting the business buy-in. How do we do this when we're all working from home? We're all working via video conference, Zoom, telephone calls, and more importantly, how do I get all the way up to the top of the tree to get that support? Next slide, please. So it's interesting. Some of the conversations can be quite difficult to have because money is being frozen or not spent or repurposed for other exercises or functions. It's one of the things that I highly recommend organizations do. And again, in speaking with a lot of our customers, speaking to leadership is fine, but the problem is you've got to tackle them in the language that they understand. Because you can have risk, audit, line management, line of business, all of your stakeholders involved. But actually, if you don't have leadership support helping you realign this, the tone from the top just won't be there. The problem is a lot of people tend to speak the language of risk. As risk experts, speaking about impact and likelihood is absolutely fine when we're talking with our peers or audit, and in some of the audit committees or risk committees conversations. But the minute you need to actually try and translate that to what the business understands, and more importantly, to what leadership understands, it kind of goes out of the window. Yes, they understand, the risk of something occurring and the impact that it will have if it does occur, but we need to translate it into something else. And people need to spend the time to be able to do that. So that means that actually, if I want to go and speak to senior leadership or the board, what's the best way to tackle that? Well, it's actually relatively simple because they speak the same language as the first line. They look at the ability to operate, execution, deliver services, customer satisfaction, making money. All of those aspects can be broken down into sort of buckets almost. That if you look at business risk or operational risk, we're looking at things like reputation. We're looking at things like the ability to deliver services and operate. But actually, if I'm going to translate some of the impact or the problems that we have given this current situation, and I need more patching done on servers, say, for example, or I need to get the IT team to do that to protect our critical data, or we need a new policy put together and distributed to the employees, and we need support from that. We need to talk about beyond the impact. We have to translate it into something that they understand. Next slide, please. So it makes sense that communication channels should be made open. And the thing is having those conversations, not just once, or you want to have a relatively regular cadence from that perspective with senior leadership to ensure that everyone understands exactly what's happening and what's changing. You also want to know if there's first line responsibilities. Depending on the level of the maturity of your organization, it's everyone's responsibility to own risk. The problem is risk can only be owned by someone that understands it. So if you're going to define first line responsibilities, make sure the people that you're asking the task of understand what that task is and what that means. Because if they don't really understand it, the problem is how they're going to execute it. And even worse, they might not have the authority or the ability to do so anyway. So really understand the first line or the line of business audience, because from their perspective, if they're sitting down on their team meetings and you've asked them to keep a message or tell people what they should and shouldn't be doing, if they don't fundamentally understand it, or there's a gray area that leaves it open to interpretation, they're going to go with the path of least resistance, and your message might get lost in the mix. So making sure that those responsibilities are really clear and that message is absolutely defined. And then you move from the theoretical into the practical. Write everything down, get it into a process from that perspective, and ensure that it is executed by the business. Tone from the top, line of business from the bottom, meet in the middle with a practical application. Next slide, please. And as I mentioned, when you're translating it into business impact, risk heat maps, risk reports, they're all absolutely fine from that perspective and very traditional. But actually, you want to start speaking more immediate language. What will happen tomorrow if we don't do something, or if something occurs? Make it about a business resiliency rather than a traditional risk conversation. If the server gets compromised, we won't be able to deliver critical services. If this supplier is unable to deliver this, or we don't have access to the warehouse, or cleaning staff can't come in and clean, so our health and safety from that perspective could be potentially compromised. Talk about the impact of today and tomorrow, not yesterday's traditional risk data and the processes that organizations would follow during this current climate. When we're talking about privacy and GDPR, for example, we want to ensure that if data is being held on certain servers, or if third parties are processing on our behalf, that they may continue to maintain and do it successfully and securely. If their individuals are working from home, if their call centers and contact centers aren't open, if their processing units aren't available or made slightly different because of where they can or can't operate, then we need to understand from a communication standpoint internally that we have the right support and the right processes in place, and more importantly, the controls to mitigate and reduce risk occurring. Now, you guys might not be the best people to message this. I see this a lot of times with CISOs and CIOs, where they come up with an initiative and they market it themselves. Engage the people that are really good at doing this. Marketing may well be heavily impacted by the current crisis, because they may well be, again, reduced capability, reduced operating ability, because they don't have necessarily all of the kit or equipment to be able to message their traditional PR or messaging they're providing. But if you can get them to actually help you with that messaging to ensure that they can speak to your employees and your third parties clearly, the message might not get lost. It might not be as academic from that perspective. So engaging marketing from a messaging standpoint is absolutely core and critical. Next slide, please. Next slide. So in summary, one of the ways of looking at this is basically ensuring that you are adjusting corporate policies to reflect the evolving world that we're currently living in. That cybersecurity initiatives, more importantly, are the cybersecurity professionals and leaders are reporting all of the issues and identifying things that could be coming down the line, looking at third and fourth parties and their ability to operate. And more importantly, as we've just seen previously, looking at actually what's changing in the laws and regulations and a general compliance perspective, and making sure that we are aligning all of those aspects. Keep it simple, keep it straightforward from that standpoint. Next slide, please. Cyber risk is never going to go away. So when we're looking at the cyber risk aspect, purely security by design, everyone's been talking about privacy by design, but security by design moving forward is something that organizations need to properly adapt with. And we need to ensure that from that standpoint, that employees are educated, they're aware of what's happening, and more importantly, you have interactive exercises so they understand the impact of their mistakes. There's nothing better than getting someone to show someone what a compromised device looks like and how easy it is to obtain and remove data from those devices. So phishing exercises, all those different elements are something that's worth doing during this. Again, it applies a little bit of pressure, but what you're able to do is at least establish a baseline to understand actually, are our employees aware? Are they paying attention? And more importantly, in the event of something going bad, do they know what they should or shouldn't do? Next slide, please. And then finally, it's worth understanding, actually, no, next slide, please. Okay, they've added some more slides. It's okay. Number one, understanding the threat extent of your cyber exposure, looking at your processes and your assets, your third and fourth parties, understanding and adapting what is currently happening within your organization. And then getting business buy-in, as I said, speaking to leadership, speaking to the board in a language that they understand about the immediacy of this and the changes that might need to occur and the support that you're going to need. And then distributing it, ensuring that the individuals within the business and organization understand what their responsibilities are. Team leaders, managers in sales, marketing, PR, engineering, construction, whatever it is from that perspective. You need to ensure that they understand what their responsibilities are, and more importantly, that they distribute that information clearly to the remaining workforce. With that, we have 4 minutes to go. Any other questions from that perspective? Kirsty, I am completed. There we go.
Just going to refresh us.
Oh, definitely.
So thank you very much, Scott. Extremely interesting and a complete recap of how you not implement, but how you execute and how you monitor your GDPR compliance. we have 3 more minutes on your section of the speech. So let me ask you one question, and that is relating to an issue that is very important or very concerning for most companies, is that they have to demonstrate compliance. And when the companies have to demonstrate compliance, that means that they are guilty and they have to prove themselves innocent. Now, documenting compliance is very well written in the legislation. However, what are your views on how you would recommend companies to not go overboard in their ability or in their efforts to document compliance, and stick to what is required and not spend too much time on just the documentation component? Scott?
Yeah, so it's interesting. Look, the problem that you've got is compliance historically. If we looked at take the US, for example, as they were leaders in this because the ambulance chasing culture of the 80s, everyone wanted to do it. It's a tick box exercise or to prevent themselves getting in trouble. With GDPR, you're beginning to see the same thing, or not just GDPR, actually. I mean, but obviously we're talking about this. The issue that you've got is that in the same way that you can over control risks, you can over evidence of what you're doing from a compliance standpoint. And one of the problems, or one of the ways to prevent that, is from an Article 30 standpoint, looking at actually from a records of processing, just looking at where your key and core and critical elements are, just focusing on, again, the same way from a cyber standpoint, where CISOs look at their key critical servers. It's really important to basically just look at what is critical, what is essential, but more importantly, look at the types of data and go for the highest risk stuff first. Pick the simplicity of the low hanging fruit and move forward.
So thank you very much. At exactly 11 o'clock and time for us to start with the panel discussion. So may I ask all the speakers to join in again so that we can address many of the questions that already have come on in. So anyway, Lorenza is on.
Yeah.